I'm building a walnut box, but not just any walnut box. It's breaking rules and testing my patience. Oh, should have thought of that sooner. Holy, I gotta save this. Should have thought of that sooner. Damn it. As usual with my builds, this one is going to wander off the beaten path, break with convention, and probably test wood movement in ways that will either be clever or end up teaching me a painful lesson later. Either way, it'll push the boundaries of what's considered normal. The idea from the start was very simple in theory. Carve the whole thing out of solid walnut. No mitres, no box joints, no dovetails. Just a carved out box with a carved out lid. Hollowed enough to give me about 2 inches of usable space inside. If I started with 8/4 inch stock, I could carve about an inch, maybe an inch and an eighth, out of each half. Put the two together and voila, a cavity. Sounds neat, right? Except woodworking has a way of laughing at your neat little plans. What sounds simple on paper usually ends up being a multi-step dance with a lot of, oh, I should have thought of that sooner. And since I'm not a master craftsman, but more of a weekend amateur, I'm always discovering new steps I didn't know I'd need until I'm forced to deal with them. The box needed a cavity roughly 13 inches long and at least 6 inches wide. First challenge, my jointer is nowhere near wide enough for that kind of stock. Usually I would split white boards down to about 6 inches, mill them, and then glue them back together. But since for this build I was only using 2 pieces, about 17 inches in length max, I did what a lot of small shop woodworkers do. I turned my planer into a jointer. I milled the two 8/4 inch slabs down to about 11 inches wide by 17 inches long, crossed my fingers, and called them blanks. On a serious note, this works really well. For carving, the plan was to use a 1/2 inch spiral router bit, hogging out material 1/8 inch at a time at the router table, until I hit my target depth of about 1 inch in each blank. But of course, you can't just go freehand on something like this. You need boundaries. So I decided to leave a 2-inch border of wood all the way around. That gave me 2 big benefits. First, safety. I like my fingers and don't want them anywhere near a spinning bit. And second, forgiveness. Those extra inches buy me some wiggle room when, not if, mistakes happen. To make those boundaries, I cobbled together a jig out of scrap 3/4 inch plywood. Sized it to give me a cavity about 13 by 7 inches. And to keep life simple, I milled both blanks to exactly the same dimensions, so I could run the same setup twice instead of remeasuring everything. Before I could even get to carving, I had to deal with the defects in the walnut. This wood had some cracks and voids, so I filled them with black resin. Not because I love resin rivers or anything like that, but because it's the easiest way to stabilize the mess and move on. Then came the question of hinges. I've looked at every hinge style under the sun, but I keep coming back to SOSS invisible hinges. They're rock solid, they disappear into the piece, and in my opinion, they're just plain classy. I've used them before on a piano desk build for a client, so I wasn't going in totally blind. Still, this project reminded me of 2 big lessons with this SOSS 204 hinge installation. Lesson 1. The mortises for these hinges are deep, 3/4 of an inch deep. That's a lot of material to route out. And if you're impatient like me and lift your workpiece before the bit fully stops spinning, well, let's just say it doesn't end well. I did exactly that. Luckily, because I'd left that 2-inch safety border, I could trim off the damaged strip on the table saw and keep going. Honestly, I don't mind leaving a scar here and there in my builds. They tell the story of when things went sideways. For me, woodworking isn't about chasing perfection. The wood itself is already perfect. Everything I do just chips away at it. What I do chase is structural integrity. That's the non-negotiable. Lesson 2. Check your stops after every pass. Especially if you're like me, working with scrap plywood double taped down instead of some fancy jig. By the time I got to the last hinge mortise, the tape had slipped, and that mortise ended up a little longer than the others. Pros have cat's Moses jigs. I have double-sided tape from the bargain bin. Once the cavities and hinges were sorted, it was time to think about bow ties. I love bow ties. They're both decorative and functional. On this box, the lid had a crack I'd already filled with resin, and I thought a bow tie would add both stability and a nice accent. But since the lid's center thickness was only about 3/4 of an inch, I figured I'd try something new. A through bow tie, one you could see from both the top and bottom. Toward the edge, where the thickness was closer to 1/3 of an inch, I stuck with a standard inlay. Now, normally bow tie grain runs perpendicular to the crack, because that's where the strength comes from. But here's where I went rogue. Since this bow tie would also be visible from the underside, and because my maple stash was getting dangerously low, I used a piece with grain running parallel to the crack. That way I could use up shorter scraps instead of cutting into my good long boards. It's not textbook woodworking, I know. And yes, wood is stronger along the grain than across it. But nobody's paying me for this build, so I get to call that efficient use of materials instead of cutting corners. And since I only work weekends, my projects move at the speed of a glacier. So I decided not to inlay the second bow tie right away. Partly out of laziness, partly out of curiosity. I figured I'd let the box sit for a few weeks to see if anything shifted. A few weeks isn't exactly a rigorous test, but hey, it's better than nothing. And if that bow tie does crack in the future, well, at least I'll get a good follow-up video out of it. If you've seen my other builds, you know I'm not a fan of straight, machined perfect lines on wood. They just don't feel right. Trees don't grow straight. Their grain is twisted, jagged, irregular. So I carved and sculpted most of the box edges except at the back where the hinges sit. There I only had about 1/8 of an inch to spare, so straight lines were mandatory. By now the box was hefty, so I decided to add a soft close feature. I went with a tip-on Blumotion unit. It's clever, push to open, push to close, and it glides smoothly instead of slamming. Problem was, I didn't have enough depth for the hardware. So I glued small walnut blocks about 2 inches square into all 4 corners. That gave me the clearance I needed. Even drilling for the Blumotion was an adventure. The hardware takes 10 mm holes, but my drill press doesn't have the quill travel for that. Not a big deal, I started the holes on the press for accuracy, then finished them by hand. Not elegant, but functional. That's basically my woodworking motto. Just when I thought I had everything sorted, the lid caused another headache. Once I added legs and raised the base, the lid no longer lay flat when open. Instead, it tipped all the way back, stressing the hinges and even threatening to flip the whole box over. Not good. I needed a way to hold the lid at a decent angle. I looked into hydraulic stays, but they needed big brackets that would eat into my 2¼ inch cavity. That was a hard no. In the end, I went simple. I routed a recess at the back of the base and inlaid a tiny maple strip into it, sticking out just enough to catch the lid and stop it at a good angle. The strip was just an offcut, but the grain looked nice oriented vertically, so that's how I glued it in. It's small enough that wood movement shouldn't be a problem. At least I think so. If I've overlooked something here, let me know in the comments. This was a first for me. From there, it was finishing. Clean up with a Dremel, light sanding, water pop, wipe, and finally a finish that makes Walnut sing. I like finishes that feel repairable and tactile, not the kind that put a hard plastic film between you and the wood. And this is where woodworking and the finance side of my brain meet. Every little decision I made on this box, the bow tie orientation, parallel or perpendicular, the lid stop, the soft close, acts like a reinforcement for its long-term stability. You can see these choices right on the surface, but their effect is subtle. They quietly make sure the box holds together over time. It's a lot like a good financial plan. Things like emergency funds, insurance, diversification, automatic contributions. You don't notice them day to day, and they're not flashy. But when life throws you a curveball, they're what keep everything from falling apart. Similarly, the bow tie, the stop, the soft close, they might seem minor, but they make the difference between a box that's fragile and one that's solid decades from now. In other words, leaving small mistakes like deciding not to cut off the half-inch strip of walnut where I lifted the piece too early and the router bit left a mark, leaving that visible isn't carelessness or cutting corners. It's me trusting the foundation I've built. The box works. It's stable. And the flaw even tells a story, a reminder that a human made it, not a robot. And honestly, I kind of like that. I don't build for perfection. I build for durability, honesty, and that feeling you get when something just feels right to own. In woodworking, as in finance, it's the hidden reinforcements that make things last. So, what do you think? Got opinions on through bow tie grain orientation? Better ideas for a lid hold solution? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'm not here to preach or tell you how to do things. I'm here to learn and to share what I'm up to in the shop. No hidden agenda, no gimmicks. So if you share your thoughts or insights with me, I'll be genuinely grateful and probably take notes like a kid in school. And if you enjoyed this mix of woodworking and rambling philosophy, hit like and subscribe. It helps me keep the shop lights on. Thanks for spending time with me out here. See you on the next build.